We'll go over the agenda for today's first 2025 governance call. It feels crazy because I think we were just discussing, the last few sessions that we've had, and realistically, we were kind of mid-topic, deep and a few sessions deep into this topic of the sweet spot for the baseline before we broke for the winter holidays. That we, are trying to summarize kind of where we sit and kind of finish up our kind of review and discussion of other nations that have this kind of abstract base and core model so that we can kind of further inform questions that were rising around, what should our sweet spot be? So I think kind of transitioning from an agenda topic perspective this week from a learning about others to trying to distill and put that into action of like documenting and discussing where we want to be. It's a kind of a logical next step. And then I want to save some time at the end just to talk about baseline coverage. So we've got some session and facilitation support coverage and an announcement at the end that hopefully you guys can stay on for, because it will kind of set up, I think, a follow-up session that we'll want to have on like forecasting what the next few months of sessions look like. Is there anything else before we kick it off that folks want to make sure we tack on the agenda for today's governance call?
This is not an agenda item, but I'm wondering, is there like a historic view of the CA baseline? Like this is when it started, these are the major milestones and when they happened? Because I think that that's something that when we look at other countries' baselines and it's missing there. And I
Yeah.
think it would be useful for me when I join this group if I could see like where it come from.
So, like I'd say there's some content that exists between our implementation guide and some content that exists between our slide decks. I'm just gonna pull up, I've got the CA baseline implementation guide here. So we have like a pretty good development process kind of it doesn't necessarily say this happened in 2018 and this happened in 2023, but it gives us an idea of kind of like what are the milestones that we've been kind of tracking to for a while now. And we have a slide deck that we put together for at around, I think, our FMM 0, it might have been FMM 1 stage, that kind of highlighted, how did we get here? So we do have some content there,
Okay, that's perfect.
but I think that we haven't really, like, I wouldn't say, because this is, while our intent has remained the same, our understanding and how it gets applied has evolved over time. And I don't
Hmm.
think we have like the meta writing about that, which would be to say like, oh, we made a distinct choice to just move forward with stubs in 2023 for our approach to value sets. There's not like that. That would have to be gleaned from like actually kind of reviewing the materials and seeing our topics over time. But at the high
It,
level, I'm hoping that this is kind of what you're curious about.
Yeah, and I guess it's
it
all
wouldn't hurt
in GitHub
to,
issues as well.
or simplifier issues. It wouldn't
That's what I
hurt
mean.
to do here's the major differences between 1.0 and 1.1 and 1.2 and, something pre 1.0.
Let me just,
But
I'm
that
gonna,
would probably mean going back and doing some archaeology in GitHub.
can I have you put in a ticket for that? I know, Elliot, we have like another ticket in Simplifier around like our terminology processes that we wanted to ensure made its way into like a page for 2.0. I'm wondering
Yeah,
if you do the same. And I think your use of what was it? The like forensic or archaeology
yeah.
is like, I think we can get a good deal of it from our issue log and a good deal of it from our content, but we might try to keep it kind of framed at a level that we can kind of speak to.
Yeah, okay, I'll put something in for that. I just need to note that I have to leave at the bottom of the hour. And one thing that would be good to do is figure out whether we're meeting next week during the HL7. No, next week, 2 weeks from now during the HL7 working group meeting.
Okay. So let's tackle that first. In 2.0. Okay, so the sessions that you're referring to are, let me see if, so it's, oops, let me get that back on screen. It is the 24th, so it's next week, right? Or are you talking about the 31st? Elliot.
The 31st is when the working group meeting is the 27 to 31.
Yeah. Sorry, I was talking to a muted mic.
Okay, I got
Right.
you back, Elliot.
Thank you. The advantage is we don't have to account for travel this time.
Yes. And the other one was profiling call on 2/7, which would be during Pin Can, Projectathon, Connectathon, Plugathon.
Well, if we skip both weeks, then we stay in cadence.
This is true. Would anybody want to, well, what I'll say is, if we skip both weeks, we stay in cadence in the sense that like we go from profiling next week to governance on the 14th. That being said, I know like I've talked
I mean,
to,
on the 7th.
no,
Oh,
the
the 7th is a
second line.
projected. Never mind.
Yep. So let's do the first one, this first one, which would be the on 124, right? Or sorry, 131. So for the folks that are attending working group meeting, are there any concerns about being able to kind of pop out for an hour during the traditional baseline time?
I know I'm going to be on a plane, even though I'm not traveling to the working group. I'm going on vacation that day. So
To warmer places, yeah.
yes.
Well, maybe the way to flip it is instead, if we were to host the call on the 31st, the governance call on the 31st, are there folks like who would be able to attend? I think that's probably because we might have some folks that can attend, and some that can, that are both going to the working group meeting and that aren't. So we have Joni distinctly can't.
I don't know. I'm unfortunately not going to be able to go to the working group meeting. We've got a corporate event that week. And I get home on Friday, which means I'll have a week of catch up on Friday. So I don't know whether I'll make it. Even though I'm not occupied by the working group meeting.
Anyone else? And any concerns why we wouldn't? I mean, if we've definitely had the calls during the virtual one in the past.
If it helps, the IHE event stops. I think it wraps up by noon. There's no events planned for the afternoon.
For the 7th, you mean?
For the 7th, yeah.
Okay. So in thinking about the 31st, my feeling is, let's just tackle that one first from a logistics perspective. What we've done in the past is still hosted a session, and then typically like we won't have any like formal votes or like major topic items that we wouldn't be returning to. So like we can maintain the call for anyone that can join us on the 31st, and then we always, as always, we do recordings, and then do a recap on our next governance call, which would be on the 14th. Does that seem reasonable for folks?
Yep.
So record, no major voting, recap on the 14th. All right, so then 2-7. So Ken, you had noted that we may not, like, there may not be a direct conflict because of the plug-a-thon, project-a-thon, connect-a-thon ending earlier on Friday than our traditional baseline time. I will be on a plane coming back from Toronto, so we can still host it. It's effectively like it's one of the profiling calls, which makes it easier to kind of spin up if folks want to kind of talk through the issue log. But we just would need coverage for that session.
Will there be any issues coming out of the projectathon that we might need time to kind of get into a queue or something?
I mean, ideally, we can kind of reflect back on the projectathon and put some learnings in. I don't know if that means that we have to do them on the 7th though, which would be like the last day of the event. But that would be something potentially that, like, if folks wanted to dial in and kind of share, they certainly could. I just would need to know who to give the dial in details to. Is anyone super keen on this, on hosting on the 7th? We can do it one last, so if we're not hearing anyone super keen, we'll probably do one last call on the profiling call next week. I'm just gonna say, like, are on hosting, but we'll ask again on the profiling call 124. All right. Anything else that we want to make sure we add to the agenda before kind of getting into it? Okay. Perfect. Thank you, Elliot, for putting that into the change log. I just saw that here. So that might be actually a good, like, a good 2.0 ticket to work through on one of our future profiling calls. All right, so I'm going to do a really quick recap of kind of where we sat on our base and core reviews. I've got some slides that kind of distilled what we had been like examining and kind of what we found, and with the goal of kind of having these be like today's session be a little bit more kind of discussion oriented, particularly around like what we want to do about what we have found. So just in framing this, we had this question that had come up in, I want to say November, about like, it started as a question for what should be on our profile list and how do we maintain it moving forward and how do we decide what gets newly scoped in. And it kind of evolved into a broader discussion again around what should be our relationship with regards to kind of our profile list, our choices, our maintenance, and our governance in relation between the CA baseline and the CA core. And one of the actionable things that we said we could do was take a look at what is available out there from other countries that have a base and a core that are similar to ours, to try to learn what we could so that we could go into discussions around what we're recommending for that future relationship and what, you know, may have to kind of be documented from a baseline perspective. And coming from that with an informed lens, right? That we're not recreating the wheel where we don't have to. So, you know, at the time, our big focus was, you know, look at how they describe their relationships to each other, look at how they manage like the resource list and how they differentiate between the profiling choices in the kind of Australia and Netherlands model between base and core. And then, ultimately look at how they relate to each other also from like who's maintaining what perspective, so that they could inform, you know, what the answers would be when we had our quote unquote sweet spot for these types of things moving forward. So we reviewed the base and the core from Australia. Netherlands has a structure that call it a base, it's ZIBs, but in terms of like it following the same patterns that we see are very, very common in bases as an abstract layer that is essentially based on the data model. There's kind of a apples to apples comparison there. And then they have a core that is derived from that. And so when kind of reviewing, and I've got like the screenshots of these, right? So we actually went through the profiles and we said, okay, like from a profiling perspective, how do they look different, right? If the base is on the left and a core is on the right, how do they make different choices? And we looked at the kind of narrative on how they describe their relationship to each other. Distilling kind of what we've learned from these two countries is that they both have abstract layers. Both of them tend to be focused on socializing extensions, the socialization of value sets for some elements that tend to have this kind of more example or preferred bindings. Both had some minimal invariance, but they tended to be like more at the data type level. We saw some slice modeling, so like optional like identifiers. We knew to expect that because that's a very common kind of aspect of many bases. And then some data model mapping, meaning like mapping to the concept name in some other source. The other thing we saw that I think is really, really kind of prescient is that neither of them applied in their bases must support a mid-cardinality. We've highlighted this in the past. We've talked about why this might be a challenge that the baseline has and kind of being a little bit in between what is typical for a base and what's typical for a core in its continuance use of must support and minimal cardinality. We saw that both the AU core and the Netherlands core derive from this abstract layer. And we saw that there are some differences in what we were seeing in the Netherlands in the sense where, where we saw a ton of must supports and terminology kind of tightenings and cardinality tightenings in AU core and what we've seen in US core. The Netherlands core still kind of maintained its abstract level where like there were some things that were additionally tacked on, but that weren't necessarily like going to the same prescriptive or kind of expective constraints as what we were seeing in AU core and US core. The other thing that was notable in just this distillation was that both the bases and the cores in these countries are either managed by the same org, so in the Netherlands it's NICTAs, or the same contributor groups. And the reason I'm raising this is because like that does have some that should kind of inform that we're not necessarily apples to apples right now with them, given that like the same implementer communities, HL7 working groups, with the distinction of for the core having an additional accelerator group that helps contribute into decision making. We're not at that exact kind of comparative level, I think, with the baseline and the core. So it's something to consider, but it's just noted that like some of their decisions may also be rooted in the fact that like it's easier to keep things maintained over time when they're part of the same orgs or started part of the same projects, and they may not have the same intricacies and nuances that we have to deal with in considering kind of our kind of grassroots artifact and where it fits in our release cycles that we can accomplish with volunteers. So in terms of like, and this is still pretty much, it's a, I don't focus mostly on the kind of the profiling lens with a little bit of obviously kind of business lens here. But in terms of the things that we were looking for, I think it gave us a pretty good kind of map against, what's convention for us to start thinking about what might map into kind of the sweet question.
Excuse me.
Oh, bless you. So this was the only other kind of framing slide I'm going to put forward. These were discussions that we had like basically at the start of this. So, we had previously said, and this we've maintained this from the very beginning, baseline is use case agnostic. And we know that there is an established relationship between the CA CDI and the CA core. I'm using the term derives here because it's something our profilers often say. It's not a true derives relationship, but the idea is that, CORE has this one-to-one with CACDI, which is part of the much larger Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework, and typically has additional kind of constraints or prescriptive nature that's applied on top of it for identifying what is the most kind of critical elements that are necessary for us to implement in a standardized fashion. We all kind of agreed that regardless of, you know, this ongoing question of the baseline relationship to the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework, that there is a really clear kind of directive that we have to date, where if we find out that an IG, especially a core IG in our country, has modeling differences, kind of what we should be doing about that. So I think that that wasn't necessarily a topic that people felt like was unclear, in terms of like, we know that if something were to, you know, be put forward in the core, we would consume that and need to potentially, if we've made changes that, or if we've made decisions that are tighter than the core, that we would have to relax those as part of our overall alignment efforts over time. Where I think we as a community didn't necessarily have unanimous opinions is about what our equivalency should be around the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework. We heard opinions that, you know, this is becoming the de facto standard. It is at that higher level than CDI. It matches a lot of kind of what we're seeing in these other spaces as like a, you know, having that information model to inform high level modeling that we often will see in like a more abstract base. And there was concern that given the like the traction and the kind of the clarity that we have around the relationship between core and CDI, that if we didn't really understand our relationship to PCH DCF and to the broader core in general, that we could get into a position where we are either out of disharmony and we need to kind of figure out how to sync over time, or we're competing on the kind of value that we're delivering, which I think both are outcomes that nobody wants. And so the only thing I was going to highlight for framing was that I think what I captured for the earlier discussions around like why we didn't just jump to say, yeah, of course, we feel confident today that we have this one-to-one with PCH DCF. Folks brought up, you know, one is a little bit more slightly use case aware is the term I'm using in its development, and that like as a practicality of trying to identify the concepts and have like a rooting in, I think, healthcare delivery. They're utilizing use cases to kind of inform what the initial sets of scope are. Whereas from the baseline perspective, we say, oh, we're totally use case agnostic. And then the other kind of component to this was that the PCH DCF was a little bit more future looking. So concepts that may not exist in current state today, or constraints that may not exist in the baseline today. Where baseline, we've always kind of been focused and had this lens of like, well, does this reflect how things are in legacy systems? So two things I think that like I had picked up as, you know, points of kind of uncomfortability with folks, that of like why we need to kind of examine this further. So in thinking about like kind of those distilled findings that we kind of went through in December and in November, what we can say is that the convention seems to focus on these things. And so when we're documenting our sweet spot, I think the first question we should ask is like, do we still think, or do we think that this is our sweet spot, that this is where we want to be moving towards, or continuing our path towards with the baseline to align to the conventions that we're seeing in other countries that also have a core in their space. Or are there things here that we think like the mapping, or we've had discussions around slice modeling in the past, are there things that we think there's something different about the way that we're operating in Canada, or that we've like uncovered about challenges that we're hitting that would make things that we see on this list of conventional decisions, profiling decisions, not right for us? another way to ask this question was when we were looking at the AU base and the ZIBs together, did we feel like we saw anything where we're like, well, I don't know if we would want to have that be a kind of thing that we do in the core or in the baseline? Y'all are real quiet. I mean, I'm not getting any affirmatives or people who don't agree with these items. So it's hard to know where folks are sitting.
So I think we did see some things that we went, yeah, I don't know that we could make that assertion in CA baseline. I can't call them out, but that's sort of my recollection. I'd like sort of, we're the place where the extensions get created. We say, here's example and preferred value sets. We sort of set the context in baseline, but we aren't prescriptive. You know, and so maybe even if we do have slices for, say, identifiers, we say this is how you would do it, but we're not going to say you need to. So that when various other groups go to either, you know, whether that feeds into CA core or whether that feeds into the work that other groups are doing, it does provide some commonality. But if they don't follow it, it's, if they don't need it, it's not putting constraints on them. But it's saying that if you do want to do it, this is how we think you should.
Mm-hmm. Are folks generally like in agreement there?
Yes, I agree with Elliot, what he mentioned. Yes, that is the way I think we should be in FHIR, I believe. Lorraine is not there, but I still agree with this. Yeah.
And on that note, I'm going to drop off. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Elliot. I saw a thumbs up from peers. Was there anything that we saw that we didn't like? Like if I go over, I'm just going to go to this view real quick. So like, this is just, I think it's medication requests for AU base. Like there's that socialized extension, it's optional. There's the kind of example preferred value sets that are country specific that I was talking about. Some minimal modeling, but that's optional. And there is some data type modeling. I guess we didn't really talk about that in that list, but it's, you know, effectively it's just creating for data types, similar types of artifacts at the same kind of very, very loose modeling perspective. And then just including them as this kind of profile data type. So is this like, is there anything people see on this that they're like, yeah, I don't feel like that's where we should be heading or continuing to head?
I will say in general, I think we should keep them kind of optional, not means if any jurisdiction or we need to, as a Canadian baseline, we should keep it optional at this point. That is my understanding.
And so that might be a good segue into the kind of the reverse of this questions, which was in both of the examples that we saw, they don't really apply must supports or min cardinalities. And in the baseline, we've always said we kind of straddle the line because we have minimal, but it's still, we have must supports and we have some minimal cardinalities that do get applied. And so if we want to be focused on optionality, and around like socialization, how something would be done if you need it, that typically must support and cardinality are not things that align with that mentality. And so the question, like I have posed here, which is like, if for some reason we're holding on to those, if there's an argument to be said about, yeah, we need to keep those in place, the minimum ones that we do have. What is it about like our sweet spot and us delivering value in the baseline that makes us want to hold on to those, that kind of is unique from what core is already going to, like, from the value that core will deliver by having those things and more, and that provides enough unique value that outweighs the challenges I think that we're going to face with that, in that it's another area where we potentially can get out of sync over time and also have a lack of clarity around purpose over time. Is there anyone that's like arguing for, like, for some reason we think our sweet spot should still have some degree of these must supports and min cardinalities when convention says they don't typically?
So Sheridan, could I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
So just based on the recent work that is currently going on with the harmonization project, is this regarded as an additional upper layer when it comes to the must support, meaning that if in core we envision, based on the conversation with the PT, for specific necessary must support, are you taking that to the next level in baseline to further discuss if this is a necessity or is relaxed completely, versus you looking at the concept of must support at the entire longitude of baseline as a concept?
I think in relation to the core and the work that's being done to develop it, in the baseline, we would say it is a problem that requires resolution on the baseline's behalf if we have a constraint that the core doesn't. So if the core work identifies that the must support, and this is just an example, but like a must support that we've put on a practitioner role is not part of what is in the first wave of core, then from a baseline perspective, it's our responsibility in looking at other guides in the community and part of like our due diligence process to relax that. But it means that because we've applied these must supports and these cardinality constraints, we're setting ourselves up to potentially have to do that over time.
So it sounds like you need to break down the thinking mechanism here to two directions. One is, like you mentioned, the alignment between what core is now going to define as a must support, just based on our progress with core, and what historically has been done with the baseline to align within those, but also more of a futuristic thinking about must support in general for baseline.
The way I look at this stuff, there's kind of two mindsets going here. And one of them is saying, only add must support when you see that it's being used everywhere, which is like the retroactive approach. And then there's the forward-looking approach saying we think this certain value should be there all the time, and we put it at the start. And so that's kind of the minimizing the use of it. But when you see certain things that, as far as we can tell, should be there, we can put it. But either way, either approach, both imply that you have to do follow-on looks as more implementations are done, because if you've put something as must support and somebody else comes along and says, oh, can't be, it's a use case that we've missed, and vice versa. If you go along and we haven't put it in somewhere and every single implementation is putting it in, then we should really bring it back and put it back into the core or baseline. So it's kind of, no matter which way you do it, you still have to look at coming back to update baseline once in a while for this to keep in sync with what's really being done. And then the question really is, do you want to put must supports in at the start and then take them out? or leave them out and add them back later. And I'm not sure which way's the best way.
Or the third, which I think is what I'm posing here, which is like, why are we clinging to this when we realize that nobody else is doing so with their base?
Well, it's the two different views. So it's which one do you want to follow? Is it the way we've been doing it or the way everybody else is doing it? And I can't say they're wrong and I can't say we're wrong.
With us trying to track must support, is there not a concern about the definition? Like when a new project starts up, there's so much time is spent even just what must support means. Like for us trying to track it and compare it against multiple projects, are we even using the same definition, and can we even do that comparison then? And some projects have multiple profiles for the same resource that might have different must supports based on like a sender and a receiver profile. Which one do you use?
That's kind of why I still believe we should really have a Canada definition of what must support means.
That would be nice.
Use that everywhere, but good luck.
Well, the must support is currently being as a part of an exercise for core to combine a little bit of what historically been done in the PSCA and EREC. It might be a good start to borrow that and see if it could be built upon.
Well, I think our must support and baseline is very, very loose. It's like, it was created because it was like, what is the loosest thing that we could say that provides us this optionality, but that still provides a little bit of value in the role that we can play. So like I think there's certainly things to learn and that actually have been applied, like the sender versus receiver. There was something that I think as a community we've started to adopt after a lot of discussions around that in the baseline. But that what we're talking about here isn't necessarily to say like, I think the question that we're posing is that like, regardless of what we've done historically and the value of what we've learned as a community historically, are we still getting value out of the application of must support in its current definition today in the baseline that outweighs the negatives, which like, so maintenance, noise around must support definition, but I'll say also noise around must support application. So if I'm a vendor and I've never heard of the baseline and I go and I look at the core and I say, okay, great. Yep. Patient. I'm just, spitballing here. Let's say patient has in the future in the core, 8 elements that are must support. Then I go to the baseline and I see that there's 2. Like, what are we telling people? Like, what is that unintentionally, that noise that might be going to the vendors about that? Whereas, like, I don't think vendors who are looking at the Australian base are having that same question, because they're not saying, oh, I don't have to do anything. They're just saying, this is a template of the national realm concepts that I have to consider. So I think that there's like, it's more than just our definition, but it's actually like the application itself and the unintentional interpretation of it.
Sheldon, this is Mukesh. So, in fact, if we see, I'm just going, maybe my ignorance, like in the patient summary, as we have seen the IPS, from IPS to PS Canadian, then we made so many domain and attributes as kind of optional down the road, because when it came to the Canadian, then when was connected with all the jurisdiction, we end up keeping most of the stuff optional. But so just for my clarity, the CA course is kind of at that level and the baseline is one down, more FHIR specific, correct?
More generic. So I'll just show you, like, so if a core is something that says, okay, across a number of domains, these are the constraints and capabilities that we need vendors to be prepared for to support, and be really close to supporting out of the box major initiatives like patient summary and primary care and e-referral, like very, very common use cases where we have to exchange data. A base is typically more around the identification and harmonization around how we express like realm concepts. So like identifiers and realm specific terminology, but doesn't commonly have the same type of like implementation expectations like must support flags, because we don't have any type of mechanism or lever to enforce that vendors actually make those changes to their systems. Does that make sense, Mukesh? Like I'm using this as like a backdrop here, for like the Australian example.
So basically, yes, a core is sitting more at the higher level. Again, I just always debate between these two. And on the baseline, we are looking more into those domains inside.
No, I would say less so. Okay, so I'm just gonna describe it in terms of, let's say you need, let's say you need 12 elements for patient and patient summary. These are the things that you need to know about a patient when you're doing a patient summary workflow. A core might say, well, there's 10 elements that you commonly need in a patient summary and that you also have to reuse oftentimes for an e-referral and for a primary care extract and for all of these other purposes. So they might say, these are the 10 elements that are really important. These are the things that are really critical that we all have to be capable of exchanging. Whereas a base is like, it's much, much closer to the FHIR base specification, and that we basically say, you know, here is how FHIR generically might be added onto to express a country's concepts, but doesn't think about what are the specific elements for that are like fundamental and needed and have to be demonstrable. So it doesn't actually focus on, a baseline is independent of domains, it's independent of use cases. It just says, here is how we express Canadian identifiers, irregardless of like whether or not they're going to be used for lab systems or for patient summaries.
Okay, thank you. So if your time permits, can I ask some more follow-up question in this? So as you mentioned, the 10 elements or the 10 domains or the 10 elements for the patient summary, so they are mandatory or they are kind of good to have or optional, or all those 10 as you said on the patient summary. So is that true?
So no, so I'm just giving like, I'm giving you an example to describe like the sizing differences between a use case guide and a.
So, but in a baseline, we are saying it how it should be expressed in FHIR, and or we are saying anything that it must FHIR in FHIR, it must have these elements.
So we're in CA baseline, we try to avoid saying you must have these elements.
Yeah. So we are keeping it in option. Most of the.
We try to keep it as optional as possible,
Yes,
where it's just, if you were to utilize this element, here's how you might see it modeled.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
you don't have
basically
to
that
do
is
anything.
even we are trying to make it Canadian baseline, but still I notice in these meetings, or what I see means each jurisdiction has something, many things are different, the way they do the work or the challenges they have in their jurisdiction. So keeping them optional will be better from my thinking. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. I will stop.
So if we like, I think of like I think of the traditional layers that we commonly would see is the topmost layer, it's FHIR-based specification, meaning like this is what everybody agrees is part of like the common utilization in FHIR. Then you typically, one layer down is base, the national base. One layer down from that, sometimes you have the national core. And then one layer down from that, you would have like your national use case guide. That would be like your patient summaries, your e-referrals, etc. So I think what we're discussing in terms of like ensuring optionality and must support have to do with the fact that like commonly bases, which are supposed to sit right below the FHIR specification in terms of like not having a ton of constraints, in the baseline to date, we've kind of held on to some of these, just out of kind of our historical nature. So, I think we've been afraid to make a decision that is a change from how we've done things to date. But I think if we are trying to like establish a clean relationship to core, then we might actually have to change our relationship to minimum cardinality constraints and must support, because I think it creates challenges over time, and a lack of clarity between those two artifacts. So that's my 2 cents. It's not something that we can probably make a decision on today, but it is something that I think we should be making a decision on shortly if we want to say, at this point in time in 2025, this is what we should be doing to make our relationship to core more valuable and clearer to our community members. So I said I was going to leave a little bit of time at the end. We've got a bunch more to continue in terms of documenting our sweet spot. I'm going to put a pen in this now. Return to discussion. Whether we have to, and this might actually bode well for the page that Elliot was referring to in the beginning, which is like,
or you can say is a living document, or living means we might change down the road if we
Yeah.
need to.
Yep. And I think we have that stance to date. And I think we're kind of coming to this crossroads now where we have to kind of consider whether or not a change is important. To change our approach. Better clarity. Okay. I'm going to highlight this is where we left off. To return to, I think it would then be on the 31st. And we'll just kind of keep going through the questions that help us create that, I guess, that path moving forward. Starting with kind of returning to this one next time, and then talking a little bit more about like pros and cons of if we were to change our approach and say, hey, we do want to be really focused on optionality, if that changes our opinions about how we might utilize inputs like PCH DCF. But with time in mind, I said we would have to talk about session coverage at the beginning, and I'm skipping past a few. Because I want to make the announcement, we are adding to the CA baseline community come end of February, beginning of March this year. So getting the ducks in a row in terms of making sure that we've got like sessions planned out and logistics covered with kind of guest speakers and all these things. But heads up are, I will be out like professionally March to September. But I'm going to be trying to return the baseline calls in May. I'm saying May because it's no formal, May 31st, May 15th set yet. But I've been chatting with Lorraine and Ken and Elliot about getting coverage on the profiling and getting coverage on the baseline or the governance calls, and talking about what some of our future topics might be. To make it easier for folks to kind of pick up a session here, a session there. We still have some slots if there are folks and there are topics that you are interested in seeing put out there. So this is just the kind of announcement call. I think we're going to have like probably another logistics call to kind of go over what some of those topics might be, and to see if other people are interested in like picking up a topic or two where we have a little bit of a gap for a week. But generically, what we've been kind of talking about is the kind of the natural next steps for profiling. That one's super simple because we've been doing it for a while. So we know there's a couple sessions that we want to do on the terminology server and utilization and incorporation to the baseline. We know we've got to prepare for the new canonical, and we've got a lot in the V2.0 issue log that should be easy to kind of like pick up talk about an issue, document an action, apply. So profiling is pretty straightforward. I think governance, we've been talking about how the continuation of some of the conversations around the baseline sweet spot and how we can kind of turn these into practical recommendations around processes for the upcoming updates that we know are coming to CSADI and to core and to other specifications, as well as like maintenance recommendations. I think in talking with folks, unless we have like someone who's really, really gung-ho to kind of get reestablished into like the balloting discussions, we may want to hold off on like significant planning in the March to May timeframe, but I'll open it up if there are folks who are interested in kind of taking on that guest host role and driving some of that agenda forward. But the TLDR is, it's good news, and we, as always, in baseline fashion, are looking for volunteers to help with a few slots here and there. And that there's more to come, I guess, is the other last bullet in there. Is there anyone who would be interested outside of, I know I've talked to Lorraine, Ken, Elliot. If there's like a topic, like it's easier, I think, on the profiling call where, because it's like, it's easier to be like, oh, I'm really interested in fish and I want to show how I'm doing this thing in fish that might be relevant to the baseline. It's like a one-off thing that you can pick up. But if there are any interested parties, let me know either now or over email. And we'll go from there. I'm getting crickets.
Sounds good.
All right. All right. So I'm thinking we'll probably want to maybe pick up on our follow-up session topics. Maybe we'll save a little bit of either the profiling or the governance session on the 31st to kind of go through it. And this would just be from like a logistics perspective of like, okay, in April, we think largely these are going to be the things, and that we may have to take a break for, I don't know, this week because, you know, some of our guest hosts are out. So I think we might sprinkle a little bit of that into the next profiling, into the next governance calls, just to see if everybody's on board, if we have to miss, you know, a week here or a week there, or if we want to slot in another topic in that slot. All right. Cool. I will see then many of you on the 24th, which is a week from now, for our profiling calls.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Shilpa.
thanks.
Thank you, everyone.